can't wait to introduce our panelists today, our special guests, but I will just quickly introduce you our theme and sort of why we're actually here today gathering around the theme positive disruption and the future of activism. And essentially, disruption is a word that we often hear to describe a certain level of innovation, and it's very common in the future forecasting lingo, and it's almost kind of overused, one of those terms that just has almost somewhat lost its meaning sometimes. But we wanted to really explore this in the community and look at what a positive disruptor is, as we see that as someone who is challenging current organizational trends and habits and really strives for other alternatives. And essentially, we've noticed in the world of activism and in the world of just climate and social justice that many are turning to the idea of positivity or using a positive tone of voice to drive change. And this isn't to ignore the data and the science and the facts around some of the biggest challenges that we're having today. But author Vera Nazarian says, an optimist is neither naive nor blind to the facts, nor in denial of grim reality. An optimist believes in the optimal usage of all options available, no matter how limited. And as such, an optimist always sees the big picture. An optimist is simply a proactive realist. So today we're speaking with two guests who are really supporting change via positive and very proactive actions. And we are inspired by their work and their vision and efforts to really get under the hood of some of the most important causes of our time, amplifying the voices and messages of others. So I'm going to start by introducing Shauna Marshall, who's a curator, writer, and educator, and she's the creator of a newsletter called Denier, or I think you call it also Fashion Denier on your website, which I've been bragging about because I'm really obsessed with the newsletter. And it focuses on fashion's relationship with sustainability. And it's essentially a series of interviews and conversations highlighting the voices of some of the biggest players in contemporary culture and in fashion and sustainability. But she's also co-authored an amazing book called Posturing, if you look it up online, and has written many features in, she's even interviewed Virgil Abloh. So has quite a fascinating body of work and is very humble about it. Also having worked for years as a curator for Somerset House and institutions like the V&A. So thank you for joining us today, Shauna. And I will quickly introduce as well Rhiannon. Last but not least, Rhiannon is a trend forecasting expert who's worked with a number of companies ranging from WGSN to Trend Bible. She's also a member of the Trend Atelier Community. We're very proud to have her. And she focuses on cultural shifts and category defining brands that drive society forward. And what's very compelling and inspiring about Rhiannon's work is that she recently co-founded the world's first trend forecasting agency, which is dedicated to FemTech, women's and marginalized health innovations. And the agency is called Ultraviolet Futures. So before we head on to the questions, just have a very final note that today we are supporting amplifier.org. Essentially Amplifier, I will call them. I'm just putting the link in the chat. If you have time later to check out their donation program. Amplifier is an amazing organization. It's a non-for-profit design lab that essentially builds art and media experiments to amplify some of the biggest movements of our time. They've worked with Shepard Fairey, etc. You can download many pieces of art to use them for your own activist messaging, and they have many other things that they work on their website, and we'd love to ask for a humble donation to support them. You can do that directly on their website. So now on to the questions to Shauna and Rhiannon. So first of all, we'll just get to the nitty gritty, and I didn't know if you wanted to jump in and say anything before we start with the questions though, so I'm just like heading straight in.
No, I think that's an amazing introduction. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
But we'd love to know what defines a positive disruptor in your eyes. And if you want, we can just use the hand lifting that we use sometimes in calls, so that if you don't want to interrupt each other. So feel free, anyone, to, I'll start with you, Shauna. What do you think defines a positive disruptor in your eyes?
But that's a good I know you did send me the question. Positive disruption, I'd say, would be, you know, I really liked your definition of optimism, this kind of acknowledgement of the information at hand, the knowledge that grounds it, and foundational knowledge, but then also striving to move the conversation in a positive direction. So not being sort of completely blind to the issues at hand, but to really acknowledge them and try and find a path forward. I think I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. It's about the direction of travel. I think, you know, I struggle with positive disruptor, the word kind of positive, because I struggle with kind of toxic positivity. And I think back to, you know, the suffragettes and suffragists, and actually who moved the conversation forward more in terms of votes for women. Would you necessarily call their actions positive? Not necessarily, but was the direction of travel positive? Yes. So yeah, no, I think for me it's all more about where the actions are headed rather than whether the actual action is positive, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. I guess you're talking about kind of how you're trying to bend the arc of history. I think it's an interesting and in a way really personal conversation, because some people find positivity helpful when trying to be somewhat of an activist, because the topics can be so heavy that and some people sort of take a break from taking action because they find it so overwhelming, and other people find getting sort of their hands really into the nitty-gritty of supporting, I guess, big causes helps them feel more in control of a situation that sometimes really feels out of control. I guess to me, a positive disruptor is someone who just simply is going to, no matter what, move forward and try, even if the situation might be helpless, to kind of move forward. I guess these are quite general terms, but I was thinking about you, Shauna, and in terms of your work, and I know in some of our conversations, you talked about myth makers in fashion and how you were really interested in them because of their place of influence in shifting the culture of fashion and influencing what we think, whether and how we approach fashion, whether good or bad. And why did you decide to create Denier, which is this newsletter with incredibly considered conversations with leading voices to really create change? Because what struck me in a lot of the conversations you have is that they're quite personal as well, and you really zoom into their deeper motivations and doubts and struggle. And I know the answer might be obvious as to why you created Denier, but I guess on a more personal level, what really drove you to create this impressive body of work, which I guess a work in progress still?
Yeah, to be really honest, the answer's not that straightforward. I was going through a really difficult personal time, and I was reassessing all parts of my life, and I changed every stick of it. You know, sometimes you have those kind of chapters, and I quit my job at Somerset House, and I was really unsure what I was going to do next. You know, all sorts of life, personal things. And then I ended up moving to New York, teaching fashion photography masters after writing that book, Posturing. That's how I got this role here, faculty position. And I was thinking about the next project I was going to do. Curatorially, I'd always done these sort of, well, not always, but I'd been interested in the last few years of my career in these kind of thematic explorations. You know, fashion photography was one, with Posturing. And I noticed that the climate crisis, ever real, ever sort of urgent was becoming very trendy in fashion. It was a trend. It was 100% a trend in 2018, 2019. But also personally, my life was changing. When I moved to New York in 2018, I stopped buying anything new. For loads of different reasons, I was looking at different addictions. Why did I buy so much anyway? Why did I buy so many clothes? What did it mean to me? What did that have to do with my identity? You know, maybe I'll come on to that later. But so I stopped. I wondered what would happen. So I completely stopped buying anything new. And it was really, really powerful. It was very relaxing. It had a very relaxing impact on me, where I would get that panic. Oh, what should I buy? You know, it's so expensive, all this stuff. And I think, well, I just don't need anything. I just don't need it. And so out of that, I started to notice this move in the fashion industry talking about sustainability and all these kind of trends occurring. And I thought, what's going on there? I'm going to dive into that, because of the way I work and the work I do is so much more in depth. It's so much more scrutinizes things, critical. I thought, okay, I'm going to get involved in that, and I'm going to see what I can find out. And The Guardian in 2019 in May wrote an article, said that they were changing the language that they use to talk about climate change. They weren't going to use climate change anymore. They were going to use climate crisis, because change sounds too passive, and actually what we're facing is an existential threat to humanity. When I read that, I was like, this is the concept. This is a crux of this Denier project. And very naively, I began it thinking that we could shift the semiotics, the signs, symbols, written and visual, to talk about fashion. So we could shift them to become really good and really positive, you know, using these words deliberately, good, positive, you know, all these things. And that's not true. You can't do that. So I know that now. But really, there was a massive curiosity. Also, then when 2020 hit, the pandemic, the social justice movement, Black Lives Matter, the 2020 protests, I realised that research had been so guarded, been so gatekeepered, especially curatorial, me being a white woman, working in a curatorial institution, middle-class background, you know. And I thought, why would it be interesting for me to do a few years research privately behind closed doors and then announce an exhibition or a book in a few years, being like, this is what I've decided? And I thought, I have no idea. This is the climate crisis. This is, you know, I don't know. I don't know about this. So I thought I'd turn the process inside out. So Denier is almost like a live research project. So whenever I would curate curatorial work, or I'd do a book or something, you always have all these conversations. They're just, you know, just you and them, or they kind of push your research further to make some sort of decision. I thought, this is too important. And also, I mean, am I the one to make these decisions? So that's kind of a winding tale of how it came to be. Yeah.
That's so, I thank you for being so honest. And, you know, I guess, I think I'm curious of what more will come out, even if out of the pandemic, because so many people have questioned so much during the pandemic, and I'm hoping that there'll be more projects like yours that come out of a great questioning, because I guess the types of a positive disruptor to me is exactly that, is someone who's going to not take sort of no for an answer, or not going to just answers just as they come, and really go deeper and question more things. I think before we started the call, you were saying how you get a bit obsessive about asking questions, and maybe we can jump to that later in the conversation. But that's really fascinating. I guess that to me, this project, this whole body of work, is in a way open. It's not open source, but we had another panel discussion where we had one of our guests was Lydia Caldana, who's the founder of Futures Resources, and she has created a similar process of this sort of crowdsourced completely open body of research resources, all sorts of resources that are usually held very secretively by forecasters. So I think there's like a movement there to just democratize expertise. But
definitely, I think it's something that when I started the agency as well, I asked myself, you know, how can we make our stuff more open source and still get paid for what we do, and still pay all of the consultants that work with us, because, you know, we're women and we want to work with women and we want to pay everyone fairly, but also we want to make this information available. So yeah, it's really interesting, Shonagh, to hear how you've managed to do that, and inspiring, and it's got my cogs turning already about how we can shift things.
Yeah, definitely. And also it's a very personal format, because even though you publish on your website, it is a newsletter. So it's just like directly arriving in people's mailboxes. But I wanted to shift over to you, Rhiannon, because I see Ultraviolet Futures is the first and only agency specialized in FemTech, and you founded it with Anna Butterworth, who is a FemTech pioneer. And it's such an interesting point of focus, such an important one, because often it's considered this kind of hot topic for agencies or innovation agencies. And not to say that it's seen as gimmicky, but sometimes it does feel that way. So I was just wondering, your focus, and the reason for it might seem obvious, but you're dedicating yourself to this. So could you tell us a little bit more about why, and maybe, I don't know if you had a breakthrough as well, or challenges that led you to
No, I mean, it's similar in that, yeah, I mean, it's the cliche of the pandemic, right? I was lucky to be made redundant. I didn't feel that lucky at the time, but looking back now, a year later, I mean, I was thrust into this position I didn't think I was going to be in, where I'd freelanced before, but I was going back into freelance work. And yeah, obviously with everything going on in the pandemic, feeling a little bit low and really questioning, what is my purpose? What do I want to do next? So I had this, I've for a while now had this love or interest in women's health and FemTech through my own experiences, from the experiences of women around me, and kind of going into my 30s and being surrounded by friends who are having fertility issues, or, you know, my mum and her friends going through menopause. And yeah, I had that kind of passion or that interest, but hadn't quite married it up with work yet. So I did an amazing project with Philips that was the future of breastfeeding. And after that, I just fell in love with this market, with this topic, but really felt like while I was freelancing for other more generalist agencies, or working at more generalist agencies, that I wasn't able to bring the expertise to it that I wanted to. So it's a hugely complex industry. It's not to say that any fashion forecasting is easy, but when you're looking at the innovation curve, you know, it's not just consumers driving things forward. It's quite investor driven. You know, those big news stories actually are picked up by investors, and it's what do they see the next hot topic as is kind of where the money goes, and not necessarily where the consumer needs are, because there aren't a huge amount of emerging consumer needs in this market. There's the needs that have existed for a very long time, and it's where the medical professionals and the investors really see kind of changes happening that get the attention. So that innovation curve is a little bit different. And then also the fact that the topic is so shrouded in all of these taboos, that in order to dip into FemTech, it's quite hard, you know, to just pick up a project that you work on, a consultancy project for, you know, 6 weeks or 2 months, and to be able to say that you've managed to understand problems within maternity, sexual health, menopause, hormone health, you know, period, cycle care. It's, you know, you have to infiltrate those communities and be speaking to people every single day at the founder level, investment level. So yeah, that's what I chose to do, to spend all of my time dedicated to that and really eliminate some of the innovation for innovation's sake that happens when you get huge investor interest in a new market.
I see. So does that mean you're also highlighting projects that don't necessarily have a lot of investor backing, and you're hunting for those like unheard voices?
Yeah, definitely. Probably trying to balance running an agency, getting paid and being, commercially viable, with also that passion for speaking to early stage founders. And so, yeah, we're figuring out what that looks like as a business model at the moment, but we're about, I think we're 3 months since we officially launched, but it was January that we first started having those conversations. And a lot of the companies that we were just kind of, I guess you could say it was consulting for free, but for me, I just saw it as supporting and having conversations with. Now that they are going through or they've just raised their first round of investment, it's amazing because that kind of pays back. And it's also people we wanted to work with from the beginning. There's a company actually called Unfabled, who are a self-care menstrual care brand. And I found them, they were literally just an Instagram page with a little bio and I think 2 posts. And I messaged her being like, hey, what are you doing here? Sounds interesting. And she is just closing her first round of funding. So yeah, it's definitely kind of it's not as satisfying, I guess, as in the fast fashion world where I used to work, where you'd be forecasting and developing collections of people and they'd be on the shop floor kind of 6 weeks later. But we're starting to learn that it does pay off to work a little bit slower and invest in the companies you really believe in. Yeah.
It's interesting because it's not quite the approach of forecasting that most people know. Like, people think that forecasting is basically hunting down those projects that or brands or individuals that seem to signal the change, and then it's sort of just like, let's feature them and bye. But you're like really developing a more long-term approach, not like an agent, but in a way you see
Yeah.
the fact that you have as forecasters, we obviously are asked to inform decisions, strategic decisions. So you've taken that role on board as, oh, okay, well, I'm going to amplify the message of these brands. So that's really interesting. You're almost segueing a little bit into agent territory in a way.
Yeah, it's a very blurred role a lot of the time, but yeah, because I mean we work with, which is a little bit different as well, we work with funds, investment funds and VCs to help them figure out where things are headed, and then there is a bit of matchmaking there in terms of the brands as well. So yeah, there is a definite agent side to it, but it's just satisfying because it's like we said about that positive disruptor, you're connecting all of the dots and driving it forward. I think I feel powerful is the wrong word, feel more active in my role in this market than I possibly did in any other market that I've worked in.
And I think that's the conversation around disrupting the whole conversation around trends and future trend forecasting, that future trend forecasting can be something else than just chasing the next trend, and can play a more positive role in influencing culture. But I wanted to just shift to Shauna, because we have, I guess, a number of questions lined up, and I want to make sure we cover as many. But you've worked with some really inspirational creators and thinkers. You've interviewed people like Virgil Abloh, Wilson Oriema, Kate Fletcher. There's so many amazing voices that you've interviewed. And I guess there's a positive term alongside positive disruptor, which is change maker. That's something we're hearing a lot. But is there someone in particular that has really inspired you in your talks, or some even if it's recent, or someone who's even given you feedback? I'm just wondering, in terms of because the nature of Denier is also quite personal. I feel I'm almost, when I read your newsletters, I feel like I'm entering this personal conversation with thought leaders. So what's really, has there been something that has been changed you with these change makers, I guess? Oh, I think we can't hear you.
Changed in me, or
Yeah, it
Is
has
that?
been, you know, sometimes you have a conversation or there's an event that kind of shifts things for you. I guess you're highlighting people creating change, but I'm just wondering on a personal level for you how, you
Yeah.
know, if there's a particular conversation or moment in time that you can think of that really, really crystallized something for you.
Yeah, I feel a lot on. I think of this as like a journey. I've been doing it for just over a year, but it's been on a summer hiatus for a month or so, a bit longer than I expected it to be. But it's coming back on Thursday, so if you
Okay,
subscribe,
great.
yeah, with Jean Kilburn, legend Jean Kilburn. If you don't know who she is, look her up. She's kind of a legend. The first person to look at the effect of advertising on society in the late 70s. And so, yeah, I've changed a lot. I've changed so much. My perspective has changed 100% from the beginning. You know, I said earlier, I started it very naively. Now I see clearly a lot of things that I did not when I began. People who've really changed my perspective, everyone, every single person I've spoken to, not Virgil Abloh, I must admit, that interview is a nightmare. He cancelled on me about 4 times, stood me up. I'm waiting on the phone with the PR. He doesn't come. I don't know why. I don't know what he's doing. And then he ended up like answering the questions wishy-washy over email. So that I would say is very much not my mode of interviewing. Yeah, didn't really get my chance with him because I really wanted to ask him some pretty in-depth conversation about what he's up to. He's a big myth maker, I'd say. So I think Liz Ricketts completely changed my perspective. She's one of the earliest ones I did. The first one's Ibrahim Camaro, who I worked with when he was a student at St Martin's. I exhibited his final major project at Somerset House in a show called Utopian Voices Here and Now. So I've known him for some time, and I find him one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. He is something about his personality, his spirit, his soul. He's really never really met anyone like him when I met him. He's so positive. He's such a positive change maker. That's an interesting one because that really talks about his personal life. His wrestles with identity when he moved from he grew up in Sierra Leone and then moved there but sort of war torn, and then eventually ended up in England 15, 16. And he talks about that. It's very interesting. Liz Ricketts is someone who's worked in Katamanto Market in Accra, Ghana, for the last 5 years, doing a research project. It's one of the places that most of the global norths, or you know, whatever you want to term, the wealthier countries, because that's not a great term, but a lot of our secondhand clothing goes there, and so piles and piles of it end up there. So Liz has done this incredible research project, and she really maps out how like giving to charity shops, you know, that whole fallacy, that's gone. So I think I've learned so much. Wilson's incredibly interesting because you talk to him about being a model and sort of selling things, and he's really for that conversation with the brands. Then you get to someone like Sandra Neeson, who's an anthropologist, who says, no, we've got to shut the whole thing down. And so I've learned a lot over my time. Often as well, my conversations, they're contradictory views that come up. You know, someone like Kate Fletcher and Wilson Aramet, they don't agree. They don't agree on the path forward. So I want to present those views, you know, side by side. Aja Barber's a really good interview, very personal. She talks about her own journey, very similar to mine, with this kind of addiction to fast fashion. I don't know if she calls it, I think she calls it, she would term it that. I hope that's not an offensive term for her, but this kind of a reliance on it. And I mean, there's so many. Kate Fletcher, what a legend. So just talking to her about her work over the past 10 years and how she's really paved the way. I feel like Story MFG, who are designers, they called me this. They said that I'm a sustainability tourist. You know, I'm not from this world. I don't have that background. You know, talking to someone like Kate Fletcher, she's got so much knowledge. I don't have any of that knowledge. I come from fashion history and theory background, studying fashion with a capital F, Western construct, very problematic, very colonial, very white supremacy. And so what I'm doing is I'm here to learn. So I really, really, really respect people have information, and I would love to learn it. And so really humble, I arrive at this space very humbly. I'm not saying, oh, I'm this expert on fashion and fashion curation. I'm saying I don't really know anything about this. So one of the people I'm interviewing on Thursday is David Bollier, who's an expert on the commons. I also spoke to Georges Callis, who's an expert, an ecological economist in degrowth. So I don't know anything about degrowth other than, like, you know, reading a Wikipedia entry or something. So really what I'm trying to find out is more, really curious. And then the process is I speak to them for an hour. Some people say that's a long time, but I think an hour is good. And then I type it up, and then I send it to the participant via Google Doc, and they can make any changes they want. So it's really collaborative. So it's not like I'm putting out something that they might not be happy with. They have to read it and sort of check. And then I also, when I interview them, I give a lot about myself, but I actually cut that out of the final edit.
Yeah.
Mostly because it's really long, but also because I think it's about them, not me. But by sharing those things, it gets people to open up. So they sort of give more about their relationship. And because you're talking about clothing and fashion with a capital F, people have lots of opinions on it, even if they're sort of an economist. So it's a good subject for people to chat about.
I guess I was that really struck me when you used the word humble, and I'm just here to learn, because before starting this chat today, I was thinking, you know, about you and Rhiannon, and how there's like a humility in what you do. Like, you're amplifying voices, but you're not putting yourself forward necessarily, but the work you're doing is quite important. And I think a positive disruptor, I think you stop really either innovating or whatever you want to call it, disrupting, when you think you've got it all right, when you're not genuinely putting yourself in a learning mindset. I think that's one of the fundamentals personally about being someone who is willing to change things. You have to question things, and you can't question things if you think that you're certain. So
yeah, it's interesting coming from a curatorial background, and that is the most egomania job on the planet, and sort of realizing that wasn't kind of exactly what I wanted to be doing for so many reasons. But you are right, aren't you, as a curator? That is it. You're saying I'm right, and this is what I present, and this is the final thing. And I remember my bosses at Somerset House always wanting the last section of an exhibition to conclude something. I said, "Oh, I don't know the conclusion, you know, because maybe we don't know yet, or you know, I don't know what's going to happen." And I find that really interesting, and I really enjoy much more being the learner. Instead of the
I think knower. It's harder to sell though in terms of consultancy. That's where I can't wait to step away from the sales side of the business, because at the moment we're so small. I have to do sales and I have to do and I can't wait till I can step away, because I think there is a need in order to, you know, bring in consultancy work to position yourself as authoritative and the expert. And that doesn't always feel comfortable to me for all of the reasons that you've just said. And there's part of me that feels a little bit jealous, Shauna, of the kind of the way you're set up, that you've put yourself in a position where you don't have to do that. You know, you can be, you know, more curious and genuine, and not have to say, there's less of a kind of transaction there between my skill set and the businesses, if that makes any sense.
Well, I don't earn any money though, and that is problematic. And let's be really honest about that. I've got to a position now where I feel like I've reached the end of the road in my fashion journey, because I'm so unwilling and unbendable to do certain things. Now I teach, I think that's okay, morally okay, I can do that. But, you know, curating a Valentino exhibition, absolutely not, no way. I don't know how I would approach that now with the knowledge I have, and not be a myth maker. So I feel like I understand exactly what you're saying, but I'm literally earning nothing from Denier, and there's no aim. I tried to sell the book as a book idea, and even then I was like, I don't even really think this is what I want to do with this project.
Oh, I love your transparency though, because it's something that always kind of gets me is, how do you be a positive disruptor and make money and pay your bills? And I think it's definitely a topic that's relevant in this positive disruptor conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, even in terms of hosting the Trend Atelier Community, it's behind a paywall, and you know, some might argue, well, why isn't it free? But you know, we're not sponsored and we're not funded, and this is the hard work of people. Like, nothing totally comes for free. And I guess that's maybe another conversation also of our relationship with money.
Sorry, we're derailing the chat here.
Yeah, really derailing the chat, but in a way we aren't, because being an activist or a positive disruptor, whatever you may want to call it, there's a level of sacrifice too. There's a level of self-sacrifice sometimes, and creating an exchange value that isn't perhaps the dominant one in society at the moment. So I do think that it is somewhat connected to what we're saying. And
and I think you mentioned sponsors. I think sponsors will be very much part of the picture for us going forward. But we're trying to figure out who those sponsors are, which ones feel right for us. Because again, it's a tricky conversation. Are you enabling people, enabling these big brands to be performative, or are you actually letting them sponsor some genuine work that you're doing? It's interesting.
I think being disruptive, like Shauna, you were saying, I have conversations with people who have opposing views, maybe even perhaps different views to yours. That's in a way part of the conversation. I sometimes have worked, you know, I might have worked with people, you could question what their work or not, but I've also seen the effect of having conversations on the inside and changing the minds of people, and how powerful that can be. So it's a complex conversation when it comes to even just fashion sustainability. But I wanted to ask you, Shauna, like, you have an interesting question that you tend to ask generally at the end of your interviews, where you say, you often ask your guests about the utopia or dreams they have for fashion as your last question. And I was really struck by Kimberly Jenkins' answer. For those of you who may not know her, she's the founder of the Fashion and Race database. And she answered, that's a tough one. A quick answer would be that there isn't harm being done in terms of the labor to make things, from humans to animal, that there isn't suffering involved. It's tough because there are many glamorous aspects of fashion that I love, but now, as a fashion scholar for 10 years, you see the glamour quickly gets chipped away when you realize everything behind it, hence the word glamour. This shows I think when she was saying that, it just really shows the innate tension in our relationship with fashion, love or hate, especially when you start to enter and unpeel the climate crisis that we're in. And one that, you know, you very candidly just talked about what you're not willing to do anymore. And I was just wondering what led you to ask this question at the end of your interviews. Was there, like, because it's quite a positive, you know, thing to ask as well. It's quite hopeful.
Well, it comes from, in 2016, Somerset House, I was still working there, did a year of, it was the 500th anniversary of Thomas More's Utopia. Wow. And so did a year-long celebration of utopias with King's and the Courtauld. It was the first project they'd ever teamed up on together. Don't know if they ever did it again. And so I was still there, I was working there, and I curated an exhibition called Utopian Voices Here and Now, and it commissioned 6 artists. Ibrahim Camaro is one of them. And they were already making this work. I didn't commission it. It wasn't that sort of thing either. It was like I heard through the grapevine. I put my ear down to the ground to see who was making work that was dealing in utopias, and found 6 amazing people who were already doing things. And I thought, right, well, I can use this money and this platform, this colonial building, to amplify these voices. And this was in 2016, so it launched just when the Brexit vote had just happened, and then Trump was elected at the end of the year, November. So it was a really dark time, if you remember. Also the Syrian war and refugees. I mean, there was so much going on at the time. It was a very heavy year, and I was curating this year, I forgot the tagline, year of dreaming and possibility or something like that. And it was just kind of, I've thought about it a lot as a project since, I think, and my missed opportunities. I always think sometimes these things take years to seep in, or you change or evolve. And so I've often thought about that project and how I could have done it differently. And so I like to ask the question because I think dreamscapes might be quite important in this imagining. I feel like people can't really imagine alternative, like, you know, an alternative to capitalism. There isn't one. I've forgotten the quote. You know, if we don't have capitalism, we all die, or something like that. I can't remember the quote, but you know, that kind of thinking is so entrenched in our societies that this is just the way it is, that I think that you know, unhinged kind of dreaming is really quite inspiring. And I didn't know what I might do, you know, thinking as a kind of curator, I didn't know what I might do with those responses over time. You know, maybe they might be really interesting, all these different responses to this utopia. But I think you're right, Kimberly does really present this challenge. And unlike Kimberly, I've let that go much more than her. I've let my past go, my training go, fashion with a capital F go. I've let it go now. And I see her challenge still, where she's learned that that's the history, that's the way we approach it, fashionable dress and object-based, or very object-based. And so I liked her answer. I thought it was really good. It's really challenge you.
Yeah.
To think.
I remember that exhibition at Somerset House. I didn't know you curated. Little did I know you'd be sitting here. But that's really interesting to me, because when you talk about dreamscapes, I think that's a really important aspect of future forecasting as well, to employ certain aspects of dreaming, storytelling, almost plunging into your creative subconscious sometimes, or speculative design, to imagine this future and step away a bit from certainty, and only use that as a tool to show others what the possibilities could be as well, like on a sort of pragmatic client work level. So it's like, I guess it echoes to Rhiannon's point, like what the tension between these very creative ways of showing the future or dreaming the future, and then like the commercial tension. But I guess we're going to have some time for questions and answers, but I have so many questions. I wish we had more time. It's always like this, but I was wondering, and this might sound a little bit jaded, but ID recently posted a post that was said, if everyone's an activist, who is? And I was just wondering if, you know, everyone's disruptive. I guess what are your thoughts on this sort of like mainstreaming and almost like commodification of activism? Even we saw recently with the US TV show that just got like canceled. So it's a very current topic. do you, otherwise, if you don't have much to say about that, I have plenty of other questions, but.
I think I have a lot of opposing thoughts about it. One minute I'm like, no, it's good because it drives the overall conversation forward and it normalizes some of the conversations that would have been tricky before. And then the next minute I get caught up thinking about misinformation and performative activism. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it makes my head want to explode. So I'd love to say I had a clear answer, but for me, I'm on both an extreme, it's not helpful, and an extreme, it's very helpful. And I don't sit anywhere in the middle.
Yeah. Shauna, do you have any thoughts on that? I think Kate Fletcher talks a little bit about that in her interview.
Yeah, I feel like it, I don't know if this is like too simplistic to say. In my personal life, my opinion, I've become particularly anti-capitalist. So I think when you're working in this capitalist structure, say you're posting on Instagram and you're saying, I'm an activist, and you want to perhaps secure an article about yourself in a magazine like ID that writes about what a great activist you are. And at the same time, they're promoting all these cool clothes that you can wear as a cool activist next door to this kind of activist. And then that, you know, the brand might be, I don't know, Gucci is just an example. Gucci might be the activist brand that's next door to the article about the activist, and the activist might want to get a SponCon post on the Instagram, so they sort of hope for that and they raise their followers. And I think working in that system, and this is me, I'm really not judging anyone else. I can't do that, and I don't use Instagram anymore, because I felt like it was bad for me personally. Yeah. And so I think I've liked the quietness about my activism. I don't do any marketing for Denier. I mean, this, I guess, could be like prep PR, you know, but we know each other, Geraldine. But anyone who finds it, I think, how on earth did you find it? Because I don't promote it. So it's just word of mouth. Mm. And so I have the link on my Instagram, but I don't use Instagram. So you might find it through that if you just looked at me or something, or Rhiannon posted about me. So then someone might click and they might find it. But otherwise, I don't do any marketing of it. And I just like that it sneaks in your inbox, and you've chosen for it to be there. You've actively subscribed. And so I think for me, I was wondering, you know, actions speak louder than words. You know, I was worrying about these things. I was caring about these things. So I was going to do them in a way that felt okay to me. But that's for everyone to decide, isn't it? So I don't want to sort of talk badly about other people's activism, because I think it's a great time, because I think people are waking up. You know, think of the early 2000s, the mid 2000s, people were doing absolutely nothing. Yeah. I think so. It's great. It's really, well, not to say nothing, they weren't. That's not true. Ignore that as a general sweeping statement. But the mainstream was less focused on these issues and politics and social justice. So, and like Rhiannon said, that's great because it pushes the conversation forward, makes us question.
It's definitely not about pointing fingers at all, but no. But it's interesting that tension again. And I guess my final question to you would be, I'm going to try and combine two questions. I think my final question had been that, you know, what would be your utopia or dream, but I'm going to give it a bit of a twist. Maybe what would be your dream for activism? I think I had asked you to pick 3, but if you have less, that's fine. But do you have possible like dreams when it comes to the future of activism, even if activism is a thing, or the direction you'd like to see it go? I know that's like a kind of a loaded question, but
I just want to jump in because I've just been thinking a bit about my last answer, and I really want to, you know, clearly state again, it's not about the individual. I think what I'm critiquing is the system in which that exists. Mm. So the kind of big tech, you know, Instagram, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, or the advertising companies or the magazines, the way they exist. And I think that's the issue. It's not the individual, because I think often the individual's intentions are really good, really. I think they are passionate and hopeful for change. I don't know, the future of activism, I think, is really a tough question. I don't really think of myself as an activist, so I think thanks for thinking of me in that way, Geraldine.
I mean, I didn't necessarily ask the question in terms of seeing you as an activist, although I kind of do, but just in general, your view on it, because it's just there's so much talk about it in future forecasting, almost even placing consumer trends as a form of activism, like how people shop and use that as a form of activism. There's just like a total blurring of the lines. And I was just curious from you and Rhiannon's point of view of where you might have a dream or utopia of where creating, really actively being involved in critical changes.
Well, I think, as Liz Ricketts said in her interview, saying to vote with your dollar just shows how sick we are as a society. I think, you know, using your money as a form of some form of activism just shows how unwell we've become.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think really thinking utopic, I think I would really love people to get really on board with different systems like degrowth or, you know, the commons, and see them as possible, try and start to experiment with them. And perhaps that's not activism, but more community-led. Belle Jacobs, who's part of the group with Geraldine and I, she was telling me yesterday that she started working hyper locally with her community in London where she lives. And that, I think, is really interesting. And so you're making change, you know, because I think sometimes with activism, it's like, oh, I'm going to fix the whole world. And it's kind of white saviorism really comes in. But maybe it's just really small. Maybe it's just really local. And you know, you join your community garden and you stop driving a car. I don't know. I just feel like everyone's a little everyday activist.
No, I definitely agree. I think, I mean, sounds very dreamy, but the removal of fear for a lot of women who want to be activists or share their personal stories, and there not to be consequences of violence or shame, or, you know, having to leave their community, or, you know, being outed. I think particularly for certain marginalized communities like LGBTQ A+, always a mouthful, you know, for them to really be able to share their story and become activists without having to leave their lifestyles or their communities and live in fear, I think. But yeah, that's big, big dreams.
Yeah, it was, I guess, a loaded question. I guess we have a bit of time for question and answer. We have 5 minutes. Would anyone like to, does anyone have a question for our guests today? And I'm going to take advantage to just put in the chat Amplifier's link, but also the link to Denier again and Shaunagh's work. And in the meantime, if someone would like to come forward with a question, our panelists are here. We can take advantage of them. I'm going to post also Ultraviolet, more about your work, and Shauna, your links. I'm trying to do the mega sharing. But if nobody has a question, I might have a last question, but does anyone have a question? Susan?
I wanted to actually, I think it's Shonagh, you mentioned community involvement, and I actually was listening to a talk today, the Royal Society of Arts. I don't know if anyone else was on that call, but it was about who gets to imagine the future, and it was about putting communities at the heart of imagining the future. And it was, I think, you know, very much about positive disruption. But one of the things that came out of it was that a lot of the disruptors, both to date and ongoing, have come from a kind of either from the government or an elite, or a kind of educational, I mean, I see it now as this kind of educational elite who are, I think there are lots of people who are perhaps missing out on having their say in how the disruption should be carried out, and their vision, perhaps what they would like for the future is perhaps overlooked. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really big problem. I think it's a really big problem. You know, white Western elites sitting around in rooms talking about future. I mean, you know, it's what we did at museums. You know, sitting and talking about, I don't know, diversity. It's really problematic, and I think we need to think of ways where that power can shift, where voices are being enabled to be having an opinion and talking about what their future wants to be. We talk about it a lot in Fashion Act now, Geraldine's a part of, about labour rights movements, for example. You know, I'll shift it back to fashion just because where I feel safest. But, you know, this idea that, you know, you're going to go in and sort of say, oh, well, we're not going to make any more fast fashion's over. So lots of people might lose their jobs. What happens to those people? Lots of people in the labour rights movement say that's completely unfair. And, you know, you saw that with the coronavirus pandemic. But Sandra Neeson said, you know, look at the word supply chain. These people are chained to us so that the West can be fashionable, which is, you know, alarming and ludicrous and violent and problematic. And so I think, I don't know, honestly, I don't know, but I think that idea that someone does know needs to change. I think that centralized way of thinking, where kind of sitting around in a kind of room deciding, is incredibly colonial. And so I don't know. I think there's a lot of processes that need to change, ways that we do that type of thinking needs to change, and listening needs to happen a lot more.
Yeah, and I think it touches a little bit on what I think you've summed it up in a much more eloquent way, Susan. But what I was trying to say about the consequences as well, you know, for a cis white woman sat here, I can speak fairly freely and there are no consequences. And that's where we need to put the support and, you know, the structural change in place to support those marginalized voices in order for them to be able to speak in the freedom that we have without those consequences being there.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a project that I highlighted that we talked about in the community, and I can't find the link, but it was this wonderful project just interviewing a number of people, farmers, just people you wouldn't normally see featured in the conversation about the future. And I think that needs to be, it's marginalized communities, but it's also marginalized roles in society, teachers, nurses, just of any sexual denomination or race that you know, I think there's that other layer as well of jobs that we undermine that are key to society. All jobs, all the people we need to run our world that we take for granted, drivers, everyone. I think that they need to be included in the conversation as well. But I guess that finishes our talk. It's been really wonderful having you both today. Thank you so much for your time. I just want to remind you the links are in the chat. And I think on Instagram, I've regularly mentioned Shauna and Rhiannon, although Shauna's not really active on Instagram. It's good to know. And that sums it up for tonight. And I'll, for those of you in the community, I'll post the replay. It was wonderful to have you all. And yeah, and don't forget to give a small donation or bigger donation to Amplifier. They're really an amazing organization that have been existing for years. and I encourage you to check them out.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Thanks very
you,
much.
Geraldine.
Yeah, great conversation. Thank you.
Great conversation. Thank you so much for. Okay, well, have a great evening, everyone.
You too.
Or day from wherever you are.